Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the presentation of the Left Out and Misunderstood Children and Digital Policies project. We will be talking through a tremendous amount of work that this project has been, which has been running for almost a year. It's going to be a brief presentation, kind of a bird's eye view, an overview of what we found, because there's such rich detail and kind of rigorous analysis in the reports that we wouldn't be able to present that in about 10, 20 minutes as part of this presentation. So I really encourage people to read through the reports that we have presented and that are available on the Digital Futures for Children website. I will talk you a little bit through this project, but the most important thing, first of all, is that this was, as I already said, a tremendous amount of work. We analyzed over 300 policies in 35 countries and organizations with the research assistance of almost 21 students and from various parts of the world who all had an intimate knowledge of the languages in which we were analyzing these reports and of the kind of policy context and landscape that we were looking at. And even if we didn't completely understand the complexities and the detail, we learned a lot on the way. So we will also be presenting some of these lessons learned on how to do research of this matter. But the most important thing is kind of the research question that underpinned this all, which kind of the overarching research question was about the ways in which digital transformation and inclusion policies take children and their rights into account, potentially exacerbating or mitigating existing inequalities. Let me give you a little bit of context to why we thought this was an important question to ask. Because first of all, around the world, policies are popping up that are shaping the digital future and trying to influence the digital present. And we here make a distinction between digital transformation and digital inclusion policies, where transformation policies are more oriented towards the future in terms of kind of a kind of glossy future in which digital technologies are going to lead to progress, going to transform societies, and have a kind of more positive hint to them. Then the digital inclusion policies, as we've seen them, are more focused on the present in terms of concern that certain people and certain groups or certain regions are being left behind and are not able to take part fully in a digital or increasingly digital society. So this is one of the kind of important things of the broader landscape. Of course, children are a fundamental part, not just of the present, but they are also the citizens and the kind of human beings, the persons that will be part of that digital future. And these policies are shaping that future. So we wanted to see to what extent they were considered in these policies that were not directly aimed at them, but that would have a big impact on their lives. So for this project, we didn't look at policies necessarily that was specifically focused on children, but we did include some policies like education policies that were quite, of course, directed towards children and young people. Now, one of the other elements of this was to not only understand whether children were taken into account in meaning and whether they were taken into account in meaningful ways, but also whether inequalities or the diversity amongst children was considered in these policies. Was it a one-size-fits-all for all citizens? Was it kind of adjusted to different kinds of young people and children? Children in this project was really children under 18. And later when we talk about the methodology and how to define which policies to include and not, which my colleague Shivani Rao will do, you will see that that was actually quite a difficult project to do. So first of all, I wanted to say thank you to all the research assistants and the tremendous amount of work that has gone into this project. Let me talk you through the 3 reports that we've eventually published. One is a kind of what might be considered more like a global overview or the executive summary, which looks at the kind of consistent patterns that we could observe, some of the things that we might consider best practice that we've observed in these countries. These countries were selected based on not being the usual suspects, in the sense that they were countries from continents, regions that are often not understood or not part of larger research projects or policy evaluations, in languages that were not, or in countries that with languages that were not necessarily have English as their first language. And so we were really trying to look at some of the most understudied countries in the world. So we paid, while we discuss countries, European countries, North American kind of countries, North American, the USA and Canada, we don't put as much emphasis on that as to these other regions that might have been left out of previous investigations. So the first report is this kind of global overview or executive summary. The second report goes into detail with in-depth analysis on all the countries that we studied. We also looked at intergovernmental organizations and regional organizations that steer government policy. So in this project, we are looking at government policies and not commercial or large tech companies' policies, but really we focus on policies for which governments and the ministries have a responsibility and could be held accountable for. We also published a third report, which my colleague Shivani Rao will be presenting later on, which is kind of a methodological toolkit to digital policy analysis. Because as I already said, we learned a lot on the kind of difficulties of even getting to the what we might call data in terms of the analysis that we were then able to perform to come up with some recommendations for policymaking. And it was a kind of a learning process where we got a lot of requests when we were presenting some of this work before, where they would say, like, we would love to know how to do this. So we decided to separate out this report. So instead of publishing one report, which was the original intention, we published 3 reports to give all these elements of the project its due recognition and space in terms of importance. I will talk mostly through the kind of global review. So what are the consistent patterns that we found? And one of the things that we looked at was the discourse in which policies that did mention children were embedded. So the kind of discourse is kind of the ideologies or the kind of ideas behind the norms and values that are behind the policies that we looked at, and where we noticed that children were mentioned. And we could see that in this framework that we used, which is the social policy goal framework from Liu Hausbrand Wang, which was published last year, that where there's a distinction made between economically development of a country or of a region, social inclusion oriented policies that really try to kind of look at social, maybe kind of who is being left behind, or how to make sure that the opportunities in a society are equally distributed. Then there was another framework that was about individual rights, which we identified as kind of human rights, more generally human rights oriented discourse, but also, of course, children's rights, both in the UNCRC, but the Convention of the Rights of the Child, but also in terms of the kind of general comment 25, which is child rights in digital environments. And there was a fourth type of discourse that have been identified in this social policy goal framework, which is one around civic participation. So really policies that were more focused on securing democracy, participation in decision making, and things like that. What we saw in the policies in which children were mentioned is that there was a kind of a real emphasis on economic development. And we'll see later when I talk about how children were represented in these policies that this had a big impact also on how children were seen as part of these policies. There were also quite a few policies that talked about social inclusion, but there was some issues with how social inclusion was defined. But we see that it's actually really difficult to say, like, this is the main kind of discourse that in the country around policies that are presented. Often there was a combination, especially kind of economic development and individual rights, or social inclusion and economic development, they often come together. Now, for when we looked more in detail at the analysis, or when we analyzed the policies more in detail, and did a more in-depth exploration of how children were represented. So if they were mentioned, were they kind of engaged with in a meaningful way? We used this model that that comes from the Digital Skills to Tangible Outcomes project that has also underpinned a lot of my work, which talks about how both the individuals, the people, the kind of groups living in society don't come into a neutral space, but that historically global, regional, and country level inequalities have always existed, with countries and regions having different types of resources, kind of policies, regulation, have different values and normative frameworks that can shape this kind of analog environment, or the kind of the environment in which we live, and so the resources that we have, and that this has always been unequally distributed. So we could see, like in the analog environment, how these kind of global, local processes of distribution of resources shapes the physical environment of, in this case, the child. So the home, their household, the school they go to, the neighborhood they live in, and what kind of resources they have, or the socioeconomic and sociocultural and kind of social psychological or well-being resources of the child themselves, but also of the kind of important stakeholders in their lives, right? The carers, the teachers, the peers, and the service providers, or that they might be interacting with in this kind of traditional environment. So we know that historically this has not been equally distributed amongst children with different backgrounds. However, we also know that these global, regional, and kind of local or country level kind of resources and inequalities in that shape also the digital environment, so that we always say kind of the digital doesn't come into a neutral space either in the design of the infrastructure, the devices, the platforms, the algorithms that underpin everything that we do in, for example, the digital internet space, or if we think about AI, these all are part of kind of a broader environment in which there's different power dynamics that shape how infrastructures are built, distributed, where they are kind of implemented, and the ways in which, what the outcomes are, or what the content is that's offered, or what an individual child might actually see. When we talk about how the child engages with these digital environments, it's that this is based on a kind of a theoretical framework of digital inequalities that kind of is kind of a kind of common framework that's used across research in this area on digital inequalities. We can see that there's a distinction between access and literacy, that there's inequalities in the, not only in the way we engage with content, but also what kind of content we engage with, and what kind of content is available through, again, these algorithms and things like that. So these are the kind of what might be called the first and the second levels of digital inequalities. But then importantly also is something that's actually a little bit less theorized, but that we also took into consideration to see if any policies were discussing these elements, is this idea of people's motivations or attitudes to engage with technologies, what their kind of perceptions of whether technology is good, whether it's going to do good for society, good for them, good for people like them, or whether there are risks and problems involved with these aspects. So what is important here is to understand that while these might be resources for the individual child that they have access to, or that they have digital literacy, or that they engage with technologies in different ways or are motivated in different ways, is that this is obviously influenced by these historical inequalities that filter through in their everyday lived environment, so that analog environment, but also that the digital environment and how it's shaped has an impact on how children can access what kind of content they are presented with, and which are supposed to, the algorithms might bring up certain content to certain children and not to other children. So this is also an important part of that kind of digital inequalities. Now, the third level is actually one of the most kind of important in terms of the project, is whether there is an understanding of how these kinds of inequalities in the digital and the analog environment might lead to different outcomes for children with different backgrounds. And we have looked at these outcomes through the lens of the child rights, as I already mentioned, and also the social development goals, because these underpin a lot of the more broader national policies that we have been looking at, and the regional bodies and the kind of intergovernmental organizations. So this is kind of the general framework that we looked at. Now, this is important when we talk about how we analyzed it. This framework allows us to look at which stakeholders are seen as important in kind of implementing these policies, who are going to be the beneficiaries, so which children are supposed to benefit, or maybe which parents or which teachers or which schools or which environments, which neighborhoods, but also at whether problems are identified in terms of inequalities between different children from different backgrounds or different regions. So in the analog environment, so are there analog kind of problems that are identified, but also whether there's digital problems that are identified as linked to that. Similarly, we're looking at delivery mechanisms, and since these are digital policies, we look at delivery mechanisms in that digital environment. So is the solution to the problem supposed to be the provision of access, digital literacy training, the provision of content, or increasing people's interest in engaging with this digital technologies in different ways, right? And so that also leads to kind of an idea of maybe there's an awareness campaign to make people more motivated to use technologies when they don't do so in certain ways. Again, against this background also where you might regulate the actual digital environment to make sure that access, literacy, and engagement are equally distributed if a problem was identified. And then when we talk about what we look at accountability for the policies, we really look at these outcomes and whether key performance indicators have been included in these policies. And in this case, in our analysis, whether these key performance indicators that supposedly are what a government will be held accountable to are relevant or specific to children and their needs and their rights, or whether they are kind of general. And we looked in our analysis at whether these things were aligned, whether when the problem was identified, like poor children in rural areas are not able to participate in education in the same way that others are, whether then it said like, okay, one of the reasons is that they don't have access to good education, or that they don't have access to technologies in this educational institution that might actually help them access content, because that's the problem. And then whether the key performance indicators are how many children have actually increased their participation in this kind of educational space, but importantly, whether it's a kind of a key performance indicator or kind of a measurement of success that has to do with poor children in rural areas. We'll now move on to the kind of three representations of children that we found in these policies. The most common kind of far out was this idea of digital children as resources for a digital future, kind of for children to kind of acquire digital skills or be provided with access so that they could participate in a future labor force that was oriented towards a digital economy or digital jobs, and where maybe certain children were being left behind. So the inequalities there are discussed, but mostly in the sense of like an economic type of inequality. So in terms of, not being able to participate or not having the skills needed to be part of the digital future for the country, they were seen as economic resource for the country. Now, when we talk about the second representation, which was also quite common, was seeing children as victims. So seeing children as at risk in the digital environment, vulnerable and in need of protection. In these policies, actually, there was very little representation of inequalities, very little consideration of whether certain children would be more vulnerable than others. one of the things that we could see in both the resources and the victims kind of types of policies is that the two inequalities that were very often mentioned was the one that is like the rural and the urban, without a kind of a clear idea of what the difference between the rural and the urban was. There was kind of an underlying suggestion that it was economic resources, so poverty or lack of kind of access to institutions or services or something like that. But it was mostly an economic resource. The other, this was not done in the kind of representations of children as victims. What we did see across both was this kind of idea of girls or gender of the child being an important indicator of inequality. So if it was considered that some people might be more vulnerable online, it was often talking about girls and sexual exploitation and abuse. Technology facilitated in the case of digital policies. Far less common, and what could be considered as best practice, is this idea of children as rights holders. We saw very little of this. When we did see it, it was often in countries with more resources or which had a longer history of designing digital policies. And so this is a kind of a representation of the child as a stakeholder, as a citizen with their own rights in digital environments and with kind of agency in decision making. However, even in these policies, children were very rarely consulted. So there was consultation with these young people. It was also, this was kind of almost absent in the other two. So it was a bit more present in the ones. But so in the resources and the victims ones, kind of representations, there was no agency for the child. So even when they were talking about risks and harms, very rarely were children consulted to understand what their actual experiences were. I should now go quickly through some quotes that illustrate, because this was a work that combined a more kind of coding type exercise where we looked at whether things are present, but also to the way in which they were represented, so all these different elements. And so we also collected a lot of qualitative data in terms of quotes where we did this kind of analysis on. So when we think about children as resources, we can see that the delivery mechanisms that were often thought of, again, this was a more economic discourse, was providing access to infrastructure and digital literacy training to upskill them and make them part of the kind of digital future. Some also talk about educational content, so to make the content available. And we could see that when, there was often a kind of a focus, when there was a focus on inequalities in this case, it was often to bring them into the future. One of the interesting things is here that AI policies were actually the least likely to include children. And that kind of was really a surprise. I feel like with all that is going on right now, this might be changing in the near future. So if we do this project again in 5 years, hopefully children will be a bit more considered. But we can see here that UNICEF, who Stephen Foslow will be kind of representing at the end of this presentation with some commentary on the report, that they are one of the few that actually did talk about inequalities and children in the context of AI systems. So again, the types of policies that the children were included were economic, but also education policies. Many digital education or education policies were talking about gender and included children logically, although sometimes they were kind of more oriented towards students and kind of STEM degrees than towards kind of primary or secondary school children. So you can see here again, urban and gender are often part of this when inequalities are considered. We talk about children as kind of victims. We can see that this is really about protection of children. And so that gives it also a certain focus in terms of the rights. So child rights were talked about here, but it was mostly in terms of privacy or safety kind of types of risks that we might identify. and that this was often very contextual, so that in some countries and some regions, certain things were considered more problematic. The kind of delivery mechanisms to overcome these problems of risks were really, or kind of these more negative outcomes of digitization of society, was regulation was the most popular way of, so laws to regulate content, regulate platforms. Of course, this was easier to be done by kind of well-resourced, larger countries that had some impact on kind of the big tech. So the EU, for example, was very active in this area. And there we can also see a bit of emphasis, not just on the kind of the risks in online safety policies, but also making sure that children can take up the opportunity. So it wasn't just closing them off, but it was also kind of combining this idea that there is a benefit. Again, here, children were very rarely consulted. And even when we think about the way that these policies were supposed to be delivered, it was from top down, so government, regulation, law, or kind of training teachers to teach children, or there was some discussion of critical digital literacy training, but not really actually an engagement with children so much, although we can see that that space is opening up. We can also see that the emphasis, besides privacy and safety, was also on kind of misinformation and kind of information. So there was a big emphasis on this. And so again, just to reiterate, there was very little consultation of children and very little consideration of inequalities in this space. Now, the third kind of one that we might hope to find a bit more of in the future is consideration of children as stakeholders in and of themselves with their own rights, and not just certain types of rights, but an indivisible set of rights. So these are some examples of good practice where we can see that there is a consideration of the freedom of expression of children as a right, the kind of right to create and participate and play and have a right to kind of be part of decision making, yeah, so in the design as well. So we see here that this is a bit more oriented towards a regulation to make sure that content is available and appropriate for children, but also this idea of creative literacy and the provision of content for different types of or for different children from different backgrounds, and really also a little bit more as seeing them as citizens, as participation in society. However, surprisingly, many of these policies that even see children as stakeholders don't really consult with children meaningfully. If they do, they often have a group of children that is not really that diverse, that represents kind of the people who make the policies or design the technology. So there's also still room for improvement there. We also did a kind of you will find this in the methodology toolkit, which my colleague Shivani Rao will present in a minute. But this is also kind of an additional methodology that we presented, because in some cases we would have a large body of policies, which makes it possible to look at how these discourses change over time. So how mentions of children in these national or these larger scale digital policies actually increase or decrease over time, and also to what extent they are actually included in different types of discourses. So we can see the importance of the policy context in the kind of the environment in which these policies are introduced. In this case, we use this cosine similarity mapping. Andran Wang did this for this project in China, where we had a large number of policies, so we couldn't analyze all in detail that mentioned children's, but we could see that while well-being or kind of children's welfare and safety was kind of important throughout. There was kind of this idea of children as resources actually diminished a bit over time. And this kind of more ideas of rights, which was not, used in the same way as in other countries, but this idea of fairness or participation was actually less present in this context. Okay. So I'll finish with the recommendations. Please read the report for more details and more kind of detailed kind of suggestions for implementation. But the first thing, that inclusion matters. So children need to be considered across policies, not just in education policies, not just in online safety policies, but really also in policies that have to do with kind of more general well-being, health, social policies for social service, civic policies about democracy and things like that. The rights matter, all of them incorporate children as citizens with kind of indivisible rights. So not just the focus on kind of safety, education, protection, but also include children's right to play and family life and creativity, as well as having their voices heard. So that brings us to the third recommendation. There was really a kind of a lack of consideration of participation in a meaningful way of children. So really consulting children in the design and the implementation of these policies from the get-go, because these policies will impact their lives. And that is a fundamental right of the child as well, not just kind of participation, but consultation in decisions that influence their lives. Language matters. So one of the problems that we found, and we'll get back to that in methodology, is that there was a conflation of children, youth. Often when policies talked about children, they were actually talking about older children, young adults, or people at the end of their secondary education, teenagers, going to university, especially in education policies. It was really not, there wasn't really consideration of the different developmental stages or the differences between children of different age groups. And again, this is also linked to fundamental kind of rights of the child to have a kind of age-appropriate design and content and services. So the fifth one is that context matters. We could already see in the analysis of China that that there was a difference over time, depending, even if it's the same party, that there was different types of kind of implementation, but also the diversity of children and their digital environments. Like all these discourses had kind of a homogeneous idea of children. Either they were all going to be these wonderful resources for a digital future, reflecting a kind of an idea of them as digital natives, just give them access, teach them some skills, and they will make the country and themselves flourish. But also in the victims discourse, there was really little consideration of inequalities, and all children were seen as equally vulnerable, which we know is not the case. So the sixth kind of point I would like to make is that scope matters, because what we saw is that there was a lot of top-down. So there was a regulation as a kind of top-down kind of, so the government is the most important stakeholder, legal circumstances, but also the kind of schools or teachers or sometimes also parents, and there was very little engagement with stakeholders that actually focus on children and children's rights and well-being. So people like not even NGOs that work with children were seen as people who important stakeholders in these policies that really directly impacted children, even when we talked about like education, and not all children are in formal education. So it's very important to kind of broaden that set of stakeholders. And there was a kind of a misalignment between the policy goals, the delivery mechanisms, and the key performance indicators, which makes it very unlikely that policies are going, if they are implemented, are going to be successful if we identify the problem as poverty or unequal access to education. And then we have a digital skills training or the provision of online content, but we measure the success of the policy by how much content is created in the education space online, or how many kids have gone through digital literacy training, and not in terms of increase in children participating in education, or especially children from different backgrounds participating in education. So I would say that this is kind of the 7 recommendations that we've come up with. I would now like to kind of, so I've talked about this digital policies global review part of it. Um, we will later move on to having Stephen Voslo comment a little bit on the implications of all the kind of more in-depth work that we've done, which is presented in the second report, as well as the research assistants who have done this and have done this tremendous amount of work. And then, but I would like to hand over to my colleague Shivani Rao now to discuss the kind of really rigorous work that's gone into designing this digital policy analysis method and the kind of methodology behind this. So the toolkit that we've created to provide that. So this is where we will move on to now. Giovanni, please go ahead and present the toolkit.
Hello, I'm Shivani. It's very nice to see you all today. I will be speaking for a few minutes specifically about the methodological toolkit that we have produced from our experience doing this research. So you can use this toolkit if you would like to conduct similar analysis of digital policies, specifically for how they represent different marginalized communities. Hopefully, this is also one of the ways that this research can be taken forward because it's a massive piece of work. But this work can be applied to a wide range of digital policies and to study the representations of a wide range of marginalized communities. So that's the purpose of this toolkit. And I will give an overview of the four-step method that we have developed to select and analyze policies for the representations of vulnerable communities. I will do this by discussing some of the main challenges researchers can expect to face while doing such an analysis. And I will also discuss some examples from our project and how we address them and how you can also address maybe similar challenges that might arise in your analysis. So the first step is building a repository of policies that you're going to analyze. As part of this step, we define the main parameters of our analysis. We decide what the relevant policies are. We identify different sources where these policies can be found, and we collect and organize the documents that fall within these parameters. So the two main things that we do as part of this step, firstly, is defining your objects of study. So for example, defining what exactly counts as digital policy within your chosen country or region or organization of analysis, and contextualizing some of the key terms and steps from the toolkit. So on the basis of your context, deciding which documents will be included under the umbrella of policy, defining the group of people whose representations you are studying in the policies, and taking into account the unique legal, political, and cultural realities of your study setting. So, for example, in the DFC project, contextualization meant recognizing that cultural concepts of childhood and parental authority influence what types of policies refer to children, and incorporating that within the criteria for inclusion in the corpus. We also included different documents across, say, legislation, bills, programs, schemes, agendas under the umbrella of policy when appropriate, considering the context of the country. This is because determining what a digital policy is can be difficult, particularly if you are conducting multinational analysis, because it varies between contexts. So, for example, in our project, we found that many countries, such as Indonesia and Vietnam, mostly have legal instruments instead of policies. So we decided to include legal instruments for these particular cases. And then in countries such as India, legal instruments are developed before policy initiatives around issues such as data protection and privacy, and they offer key insights into the discourses surrounding these issues. So we decided to include some legal instruments in these particular cases. A few other countries, including India, also have more programs or schemes instead of policies, such as the Digital India program. But these are very important in the digital regulation landscape, so these were included as well. If you are analyzing outputs from intergovernmental or regional organizations, the contextualization process will look even different because these organizations produce a wide range of outputs such as research focused publications, frameworks, tools, directives. There can be agendas or certain declarations, etc. Another aspect of contextualization is important while conducting the research. That is, especially if you're working across languages. So, for example, our research assistants also they translated and contextualized the keywords that we were working with to search for the policies on different websites and repositories. So, depending on each cultural context, you may have to use different terms to find relevant policies. For example, this meant translating the keywords into different languages and also searching for specific cultural terms, like, for example, left behind children in the case of China. Similarly, you will also have to define the group of people your study is focused on. And while this sounds fairly straightforward, but it will play an important role in determining the key frameworks that your analysis will be based on, and also which policies to select for analysis. So, based on the group of people you're focusing on, you might choose to include policies that are not specifically digital policies themselves. So, for example, in our study, we included some education policies if they had a substantial section or if they had substantial mentions of digital education or related topics, because this is relevant to children, the group that we were focusing on, alongside digital policies generally. So, if your study is based on, say, migrants, the representations of migrants or refugees, then, alongside digital policies, you might also want to include specific immigration policies or employment policies, etc. We also included some economic policies, particularly if they were focused on topics like transformation or the future, because these policies often have substantial focus on digital initiatives without being digital policies per se. And lastly, one of the main challenges in this step is also issues with accessing the policy documents. So we provided multiple examples of how this looked different in different countries in the toolkit and what challenges arose when trying to access the documents. Accessibility of policy text varies widely between countries. It depends on many different factors, such as how centralized the policy landscape is, what the processes for digitization and general documentation of policies are, etc. And then there are also other political and infrastructural limitations. So, for our project, we found that in some countries like Niger, Senegal, Togo, there was limited access to full policy text. Some documents were available only as summaries or in news reports. Sometimes government websites can be down or they can be inaccessible from the location where researchers are based. So, in our case, from the UK. Sometimes websites require researchers to give like ID and personal data. And in many countries, we found that there were public consultations, there were campaigns, there were programs that were not anchored in a specific policy. There's also inconsistency in how digital policies are recorded and structured because accountability for digital policies is often shared by multiple ministries without a central repository, as we noticed in the cases of Senegal, Togo, and India. So sometimes you might find that there is no formal policy document as well, but there are reports on implementation. So alongside this, sometimes policies would just disappear, but they would still be referred to in other documents. So these are some of the examples of the challenges you might face specifically with respect to accessing the digital policies. We have a few more examples in the toolkit. I highly recommend you look at those examples. And we have also shared what specific solutions we implemented from our end to like work through these challenges. It's also very, very important to note down which challenges were encountered while constructing the corpus and how decisions were made about the inclusion or exclusion of policies. Following the construction of the corpus, the next step is doing a basic analysis of the documents to see three things. Firstly, if the group of interest has been mentioned, if it's been mentioned directly or indirectly, or if it's been mentioned meaningfully or not. In this stage, we also analyze the policies for general mentions of inequalities with respect to the group that we are studying for, which was children. And we also analyzed for the overarching policy discourses. So, in this situation, a policy discourse is defined as the ideas and the ideologies underpinning policy content and implementation. And studying the discourses, for example, it helped us understand particularly in which context children are represented. So, for example, if they are mentioned in policies that are more focused on economic development, or whether in the policies focused on social inclusion, individual rights, or civic participation. It's very important to note that various discourses can be present at the same time and they should be coded as such. So in the map that Ellen presented earlier, the most dominant approaches are indicated on the map, but in practice, separating discourses was difficult. Different policies tackle different discourses within each country. Sometimes multiple and contradictory discourses are embedded in the same text, and sometimes one discourse will be addressed in the text, but the overall leaning of the policy will be towards another. For example, often policies will use a language of social inclusion through mentions of digital inclusion, but the final goal of the said digital inclusion would be economic development. Next, for analyzing mentions of inequalities, while it's very interesting to do a general analysis of inequalities mentioned, if you are constrained by resources, you may choose to code for mentions of inequalities only in reference to the group you are analyzing. For example, in our project, we included inequalities with respect to children, such as implicit mentions of gender inequality through mentions of girls, mentions of disabled children, mentions of low income households. This also gives an initial overview of how intersections between the different categories are represented, which will be very helpful for your detailed analysis in the next step. While we have continuously and iteratively developed the codebooks that are available in the methods toolkit, there are likely to be adaptations needed and issues encountered in your own project, particularly if you are conducting multinational or multi-scalar research and or if you're working with a large team of researchers. This can be addressed through a few strategies that we recommend in the code book, such as frequent meetings to discuss the selection and the coding, conducting peer reviews, or in the case of limited resources, choosing only a select number of the most important things to analyze according to your research objectives. This process helps identify policies that will be analyzed in depth in the next step. So, for this, we decided to study if the mentions of children count as meaningful or not. So, in our project, we defined meaningful mentions as mentions of children that are not just a part of a list of vulnerable populations. This is because we found that many policies do mention children, but if they do, it is often as part of a list of vulnerable populations without specific engagement with the realities of children from different backgrounds, even if policies directly impact them. So, in your project, you would have to decide what counts as meaningful mentions for your group, and on the basis of that, you will choose policies for detailed analysis in the next step. So, this is the step where we take a deep dive into the selected policies. Here, we start by seeing whether the mentions of your group of interest have goals, delivery mechanisms, and outcomes that are aligned, followed by a qualitative analysis of how your group is represented and involved in the policy making process. So, firstly, updating the framework and codebook for your group of interest. So, in this phase, the digital inequalities framework that Ellen presented guides the analysis of the representation of different beneficiaries and stakeholders, different digital delivery mechanisms, and goals identified by the policies. In our project, the framework was adapted for children by identifying physical environments and other socioeconomic, sociocultural, socio-psychological resources that are relevant to children. We based the framing of outcomes on the UNCRC, the General Comment 25, and the Sustainable Development Goals. For your study, other policy outcomes and compliance standards might be more appropriate. So, for example, if your project is focusing on the representations of refugees or indigenous populations, then you may adapt the outcome section of the framework according to maybe the Universal Declaration of Human Rights or the 1951 Refugee Convention. So, the first challenge is adapting the framework and subsequently the codebooks to your group of interest. The next and very important task is taking detailed qualitative notes. So in the toolkit, we have provided detailed pointers on what the notes in each section of the codebook should focus on. Direct quotes from the policy text are particularly important. This allows you to keep record of the actual language used to understand the context and the specific meaning of the references to certain aspects and the groups of interest. These quotes can also be used later to illustrate important points in your analysis. It is also key data that can be shared and discussed between researchers. It can be used for further publications. And sometimes you only figure out at the end that something is important. And so reading through the code books at different stages in the project can give new insights instead of having to read the policies from scratch. As I mentioned, we have provided many examples in the toolkit of what the the detailed notes in each section should focus on. So I highly recommend you check that out. Next, summarizing the general findings across all categories of analysis. So after you've completed the coding of this final stage, you should summarize the general findings across all of these categories of analysis, and you should identify if all the different elements are lined up by asking three questions. You can check if specific problems identified for your group of interest and your subgroups, if they've been identified. You can look for whether clear digital delivery mechanisms are identified that aim to tackle the problems, and if key performance indicators are identified in relation to your subgroup of interest, that will indicate whether the policy was implemented successfully. And finally, you will analyze representations of the group of interest. So we recommend that you do a more in-depth analysis of the representations. This part of the analysis, it delves deeper into the question of whether policies engage with the group in a meaningful way, whether they allocate agency to them, with not only rights to be protected by others, but also recognizes them as individuals or a group with power to make and be involved in decisions about issues that impact them directly. You should also look at if there is an intersectional understanding of disadvantage. For example, whether all girls are supposed to be the same or whether there is a difference depending on where they live or their citizenship status, maybe. In your analysis, this should be linked to policy discourses, ideologies, and power dynamics that might impact policy construction or design. This process is very iterative, and framings and discourses of your group are only likely to emerge after repeated readings of policies and cross policy comparisons. In this part of the analysis, particularly, discussion between researchers is very important, and knowledge of the national, country, or local context is fundamental as well. Detailed qualitative notes, again, and collection of longer quotes will be key to any analysis of this kind. And the last step, it's important to tailor your output to the stakeholders and make clear sort of what will be the key messages that would be of interest to them. So you need to identify not only which stakeholders should be interested, but also what their priorities are and what language and types of outputs they are likely to use and engage with. So in the toolkit, we have identified three potential audience groups that may benefit from your research, with strategies for tailoring your outputs for impact towards them. So we have provided examples for policymakers and government officials, civil society, and researchers. The three main challenges in this stage of your research, firstly, is identifying appropriate formats to your key stakeholders. So you will have to identify appropriate formats of outputs for each of the groups. So for example, for policymakers, you should focus on executive summaries, key action points, best practices, and recommendations. For civil society, specific recommendations and resources for advocacy and campaigning opportunities are quite useful. And for researchers, this can look like publications that are peer reviewed, maybe available under open access copyright schemes, etc. Selecting key quotes and visualizing key findings, for example, and a few other narrative devices would be the next challenge to work through. We do offer some recommendations on presenting your findings for each group. So, for example, keeping it short and to the point for policymakers and other related government stakeholders. Maybe selecting key quotes that make your findings come to life. Maybe presenting your statistics in terms of, for example, how many times certain groups or concepts are mentioned. These might be quite likely to be noticed. For civil society, this can look like highlighting points that are media friendly, maybe those that are aligned with the narratives that float in public discourse, things like that. And lastly, identifying possible opportunities for further research. This may be particularly useful if your audience is researchers and academics. Reporting in detail on your methodological challenges and learnings and future research directions will add to the emerging body of work in this field. So that's all the steps. The methodology we have put forward is designed to evolve with experience and feedback, and you are encouraged to document your adaptations and share insights with the DFC. Please let us know if you found this useful, if you have applied it in your own work to analyze representations of maybe other communities and digital policies, and if there's anything that can be improved in the next edition of this toolkit. Thank you.
What we would like to do now is to give Stephen Boslow, who actually was involved from UNICEF at that point in time when we started this project. And it's evolved a lot, not just in terms of the project and the criteria that we use, but also in terms of the landscape, obviously. And Stephen has been working a lot in this area and been keeping up to date with what we've been doing. I would also like to give, when Stephen has given his commentary, the opportunity to some of the research assistants that I know are here, some of them online, just to give us a brief taste of what the most interesting thing or surprising thing was for them when they did this research project and what they found. So, Stephen, if you are there and you can unmute, I can see you. We can now all see you here as well. So I will leave the slides up if you don't mind, so that people have a view of and you will be in the screen, in the top of our screen. But yeah, please do tell us what you think about the project, about the landscape, about policies from your own experience and perspective, and from what you've read in this in the reports that we have given to you, in the research that we've done.
Thanks, Ellen. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. So firstly, I'd like to say thank you for the opportunity to participate in this launch, and very much congratulations to you, Ellen, and the whole team to all the students, to all the academics, to all the stakeholders. Um, it's clearly a huge amount of work and really is an extremely important contribution to this space. So congratulations, and we really look forward, all of us, I think, to using the findings, to using the toolkit, to really using this body of work to try and to affect change actually, and to address some of the findings. So if I can just reflect loosely, I'd like to do a quick reflection and then maybe just deep dive into two aspects. One really on the participation aspect, and to think that through, and perhaps one on the future, and then I'll close with leaving us with a challenge. Um, but in terms of the findings, it really is a paradox, and I think many of the findings you probably knew going in. But what's really impressive here is the systematic and rigorous methodology behind really showing this paradox that children are living in a world, in a digital environment today, and in one that they'll inherit, where they don't really have a voice in designing or in shaping how it's regulated and how it's created. So there's this fundamental disconnect. That the policies that shape children's digital present and their future don't sufficiently consider children as a key stakeholder group. Um, it's surprising for all of us working in this space because if you take a step back, you think, well, how is it possible that children and youth who are the most active online users or online group and early adopters of tech, um, how is it that they don't have a rightful place in policies and they don't have a rightful place at the policy table? So yeah, it is striking. It's maybe not surprising. Um, it's not a new issue, but as I said just now, I think your research makes a huge contribution in systematically kind of exposing the extent of the problems, and if you're to flip it, the extent of the opportunity we have for change. This thinking and these findings align with some research that we did, not nearly as um, comprehensive as this in scope or scale. Um, but I'll mention a few times that we've been working on AI policy for a number of years, and last week we released an update to our AI policies. And this is work that started in 2019. But twice in this process, we've done a light analysis of how national AI policies and strategies um, talk about children, yes or no, and if they do, then how? Um, Firstly, children were not mentioned enough. But when they were, very much the finding that you and the team have found is through a protection lens as a common theme, or through a future workforce lens. So this kind of victim or future worker bee. Um, and this view kind of, seeing children only as victims or future workers really doesn't recognize their full range of rights. Um, and it also doesn't recognize their creative potential that they have today, or their insights, and their rights to participation, to agency, to play, all those bits you mentioned. So I was encouraged, as you presented earlier, Ellen, that there's this common view of the victim, the future worker, but there is a movement towards recognizing more rights. And it was striking, the quotes you gave on that last slide, the right slide, were all from 2024, 2025. So it looks like this is a trend, and it's a trend that we can hopefully leverage. But basically, not enough is being done. I wanted to just quickly touch on the promising practices. So it's not only, I think what's great about the reports, not only a case of where the problems are, but also who's getting what right. And there's some really great examples. And maybe one idea is to almost produce a model policy at the end of this, to take the best bits from everyone, and to provide some language. And some of it is direct copy and paste, and others might be, proposed. But but to talk about where there is promise. Okay, so if I could just touch on the participation matters recommendation, which is such an important one. The content of the reports shows that children are left out and misunderstood. And it touches on, as was said earlier, on some of the processes of how children are involved. But basically, if we look at the process, children really aren't included enough in the making of these policies. So not just how they're mentioned, but how they were involved. There is obviously a need to engage children meaningfully. And in our guidance, the updated guidance, if I can just read you a line from there. Meaningful participation implies more than inclusion. It demands influence. So there should be clear mechanisms through which children can engage, can engage, but also influence decision-making and affect change. I was also reflecting on what is the cost of being left out and misunderstood. And so as we launched the AI guidance last week, one of the panelists, Abril Perezzini, said it really well. She's from Argentina. She's a Youth Foresight Fellow alum and a youth activist, digital youth activist. And if I can just quote her twice, I asked about, so what is the cost of not including children in these processes? And she said, we risk putting adult priorities and worries into technology. So that will shape how children today live and how the next generation lives. And the resulting AI will be created for adults and who won't know how to protect young people, support their mental health, emotional safety, their education. So this creates a future for children that is done to them instead of being built with them. And then she went on to say, it's key not just to ask children for feedback or just to consult them, but actually change the way we involve children in these processes. So we need to create spaces that feel safe, that feel honest, that feel serious, but are fun. Anyway, I wanted to share that because I thought that she captured it really, really well. Is this happening right now? Not enough. Are there promising practices? Yes, there are. And one suggestion from a thought piece that came from colleagues at UNICEF Innocenti was thinking about this idea of not just that it's children's right to engage them, but the benefits. And they said when children and youth and adults co-create policies, it's essential for actually restoring trust and fostering social cohesion. And that studies show that youth inclusive governance leads to more resilient and innovative policy outcomes. So I think that, it's not just the case that children have the right to participate. It's highlighting to policymakers that if they bring children to the table, the result is better policies. And some of the suggestions that came out of this piece from Innocenti said to institutionalize inclusive child participation in governance structures. So setting child quotas. They said youth, but I want to push it further and say child quotas in parliaments, in national child councils with legislative influence, and formal child advisory roles in multilateral institutions. Sorry, I know I'm coming up for time. So I think just to close, I really like this line in the report that said there needs to be recognition that not all social and economic policy goals aimed at improving citizens' lives have digital solutions. And that's a really good point. And something like participation isn't a digital solution, although digital can be used to enable participation. It's a social way, social solution. So in closing, again, congratulations. Really, I think in the work that I've done in the policy review space of digital policies and children, this is the most important contribution and most significant one we've seen to date, both in its findings and in its scope. And also that you've given not just the evidence, but the toolkit. So this is a catalyst, the toolkit especially, for others to replicate this kind of work, to hold governments to account, hold NGOs to account, hold the UN to account, and how we all not just describe children, but how we engage them in the process. So if I leave a challenge to all of us, it is to think about how to make the most out of this work. How do we think 5 years from now, 2030? This is a test. Will there be children 5 years from now thanking us, thanking this team for these policies, for this research, and how it made a difference to their outcomes? And so how do we navigate the space between the release of such work and an outcome where it's had effect on people who recognize it and who can point back to it? Yeah. So thank you again, and back to you, Ellen.
Thank you so much, Stephen. Also, thank you to UNICEF, who's been doing, and we've reviewed the policies from UNICEF as well. So also thank you for being open to criticism and constructive feedback from our side. It's very much appreciated, because I think and I'm glad you picked up that sentence, because I was going to finish my presentation with that sentence that, if there's racism, discrimination, sexism, then the solution is not going to be digital. We need to deal with that in kind of our analog lives. Otherwise, the digital is just going to replicate that. But I think to have an impact, and I think that is really important. There's a lot of people who've been here today, so I would also really like to invite everybody to kind of hopefully help us talk about this work. And if anybody wants to get in touch, you can know how to find me and the Digital Future for Children Center. But some of the important stakeholders that have been involved in this project are actually in the room, and they are, finished their masters. Tomorrow we will be celebrating, and they are going to also take on roles after this. Might not be in exactly this space, but they've had various experiences working on this project, which I don't think has been easy for anybody involved. It's been quite a lot of work, probably more than you thought when you started working on it. So I would like to give the opportunity to those the research assistants who are online. I think it's Thais is online, and Laura. So maybe Thais, if you want to say something very briefly on what the most important. I see that you're doing the digital kind of commute. If you want to say something, you don't have to, but just to say hi and thank you. If you have anything that was particularly kind of spoke to you in the work that you want to share, please do. If not, we'll move to Laura, who I know also wants to say something.
Thank you, everyone. It was a huge pleasure to work on this project. I was responsible for the Portuguese-speaking countries, Angola, Mozambique, Brazil, and Portugal. And for me, what stood out was the level of generalization when talking about children, especially with those related to education. I thought we would go deep into the children as right holders, but there was, as mentioned, just a few policies with that lens. And also the best interest of the child was rarely mentioned. So for me, that stood out. I thought would be more policies with that attention, but that's it. Thank you, and sorry that I'm here.
Thank you. So Thais is now, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but you're working for the Ministry of Education in Brazil now? So,
yes.
Yeah.
I'm a consultant on digital and media education. And so now I'm responsible to apply the learnings here within the Ministry of Education in Brazil. We are designing the assessment of digital competences for students, and we want to include them in the design of the assessment regarding everything that we learn throughout this process. Now the challenge is really implementing here in real life.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Thais, for all the work that you do.
Thank you.
Okay, I see Laura is online too. I believe you wanted to share a little bit of your experience as well, and what you found stood out for you while you were doing this.
Yeah, thank you, Alan. So hello, everybody. My name is Laura Betancourt. I analyzed Colombia together with Diego Martinez and independently examined Uruguay, Bolivia, and two regional bodies in Latin America, CEPAL and Mercosur. And among the things that stood out for me was the considerable variation across the region in how digital policies engage with children, and how this variation not only exists between countries, but also across regional institutions, and that somehow like broadly mirrors the global state of how children are positioned within digital policy. And second, there is like something really interesting in some countries, particularly in Colombia and Bolivia, where we find like this evidence about long-standing projects or initiatives. Even like they're trying to include children in digital environments, even if there are an absence of a comprehensive framework or even like a formal policy. But while these efforts are like notable and really interesting, their impact is limited because like there is a lack of formal coordination. There are not like accountability mechanisms like linked to those projects, and also there is like no long-term strategic alignment. So yeah.
Okay, yeah, not just now, but thinking a bit more in sustainable and accountable ways about how we design policies. I think that's what you were also mentioning. I believe Omer is online as well. So Omer, if you are there and you would like us to give us your kind of take on what was the most surprising thing.
Hello, I hope you can see me or hear me.
Yeah.
Yes, because I also don't hear. Okay, is it clear? Can you see me?
It's good. Yeah.
Okay, so one of the interesting thing about when I was helping on the report was that there was a huge talk about ICT4D in the Global South, and many researchers do start and do research on how ICT can help in developing the Global South. But I noticed that in the case of children and also youth, there is no direct publication policies that are written in forms, and many of the policies that are written are just protectionism. We want to prevent children from something bad, where there is not a lot of policies about how the internet or generative AI could help empower children or could help empower youth in certain areas. And I thought that maybe that was related to just one countries, but I noticed that in many MENA region, this is kind of the a norm, which is a very big shock. So when Ellen talked about helping with this, I was very interested in seeing how this would go, and I was really shocked that there is not a lot of research in this area and not a lot of policies that are written in real forms. So when we look at them, we find policies, but many of them are in the protectionist side. We want to protect children, but not on innovation and development, which is very shocking to me because ICT4D, and we have many researchers in the area from the South, Global South, which I expect them to concentrate more on children.
So you looked at the Middle East and Northern Africa, right?
Yeah. Yes.
In Arabic, but actually a lot of the digital transformation policies, I think, were written in English, almost for an international audience and not for a local policy audience, which is interesting as well. Is that the online? Okay, let's move to the analog, the physical, or the hybrid, actually. I know, Thomas, you said you might want to say something, sure, yeah. So please.
So I don't know where the microphone is for that.
In the room.
Okay.
So just talk to the room.
Okay. Hi, everyone. So I was focusing on the French-speaking countries. So I did Niger, Togo, Senegal, and France. One of the very interesting things I found at the beginning, we were looking at the presentation slides, and it was showing sort of mentions of children and then sort of meaningful mentions of children. I think initially you would find plenty of mentions of children. So for instance, in a digital inclusion policy, you'd say there would be children mentioned all over the place. But then when you would actually look at what they were saying, it was often paired together with, women or people with disabilities, and it was never sort of analyzed in any kind of meaningful way. So then you could, derive all sorts of meaning. And I think then another thing I found very interesting about many of the countries that I analyzed was that you would have a sort of age leap. So you'd go from the very young, the children that needed to be protected along with these groups, for instance, in digital inclusion policies. And then you'd go to the digital transformation policies and the modernization of the economy policies. And those would be young entrepreneurs in this sort of vague age range anywhere between 18 and 35 who magically had digital skills that they could then apply to their work. So in that sense, it was a pleasure working with these teams, and those are sort of the main takeaways I got.
Okay,
so
great. Yeah. I don't know. Do you want to say something? Yeah, I don't want to put you on spot. You don't have to if you don't want to, but yeah.
So yeah, hi everyone. My name is Anjali. I worked for the section ASEAN in Indonesia, and I guess it was very fun working with the team, and I learned a lot of things. It was my first time working in this type of project, and what I found out, especially with Indonesia, is that a lot of the policies that mention children, again, are mostly overshadowed or maybe merged together with the term youth or young people. And in Indonesia specifically, they have a lot on development, for economic development. So training the children for that purpose, for the purpose of the country and improving the country state. And only recently that Indonesia actually released a policy that specifically focuses on children's safety online. But again, that policy is still adult-centric and still needs to work a little bit more on. And I guess that's it. That's from my side. Again, thank you for the opportunity. It was very fun working with everyone. Thank you.
I know that there's some other people. Do you want to say something, Shona? No? Okay. I think we heard from like you worked also on India and on with Shivani, so we already heard of some of the problems, especially also in India, where policies would just disappear, and we had policies that we had downloaded for the previous project that were still supposedly in action, but we couldn't actually access them anymore. This was a particular problem there where we couldn't find any. So accountability also disappeared. You want it? No. Okay. Good. So we can now we have about 20 minutes, I think, to wrap up. So with some questions, are there? If you have questions online, I think they're being managed. Yeah. Is that okay? Do you need to give any instructions? So we'll take probably some questions from online and then give people the chance to ask some questions from the room here. And then just before you run out, when you're in the room, just be aware we are planning on going to the pub afterwards, if that encourages you even to stay a little bit after. But yes, Marisa, you have control over the online, I think.
I think one question that's come up a couple of times is a little about country selection. Okay. So, a student at the University of Glasgow was wondering about the reasoning behind the country selection in research. Another question from Divine Rezia, an assistant professor at Loyola College, India, who finds the report presentation very interesting. Has a question in terms of policies, and especially in a country like India, these often don't take form into action. There's a huge gap on application of these policies in practice. How do we think we can make a change in this action? I don't know if you want to.
Yeah, I can. Do you want to do? Is there a third one? Then we'll take a third one if not.
Let's take a third one.
Okay. Yeah.
The third one is from Lena from techandsocialcohesion.org, who has a question. Is this aimed at the large commercial social media platforms, such as AI companies as well? Have you sensed any signals that they are in need of such a toolkit? They have enormous research and design resources, so I wonder how much the lack of design with kids is a choice rather than a toolkit.
Okay, I think they actually follow quite nicely in terms of in order. So I'll take them. And Shivani, please also jump in if you think. I just realized that we didn't actually put the country selection in as, and we have other documents in which we, this is where policy documents disappear, but there was actually quite a specific kind of reasoning behind the selection, is that within each region, we wanted to represent these regions that tended to have be underrepresented. So while we analyze Europe, for example, or North America, we don't really kind of go in as much depth for these regions, even though we presented. In the other regions, we wanted smaller and bigger countries from which we knew that they had kind of, you know, at least from the outside, they were known to have a developed digital policy landscape, and others that did not. So beyond the language, saying like, you know, which are the languages or the countries that tend to be underrepresented, we also wanted to have larger economies, large kind of problems of inequality, for example, or smaller countries that had a very developed policy landscape. So we started with the idea of having at least 3 per region. It turns out to be
many more. Of course, there's always some reasons, for kind of, practical reasons like Russia is not represented, for example, and in the US, as was mentioned by Shivani, we only looked at certain states that had taken a leadership role in terms of developing policies around this topic. So that's also why probably it was red in terms of it looks at social inclusion, because the states that were very active are likely to be policies that have a kind of more social agenda as well. Otherwise, because they don't have federal policies, our infrastructure policies tends to be. So that was a little bit of the kind of reasoning behind, and it might be a good idea to actually in the methodology report when we updated it to talk a little bit more about that for the project in particular. So about application, yeah. So this project explicitly doesn't look at if these policies are actually implemented. And because it was, first of all, to see what policies out there. One of the other problems with a lot of policies, and especially, and I think India was mentioned, right? It's often very vague who is supposed to be doing the implementation of these things. Even in regional bodies, they don't have a lot of, they work with a lot of governments, but they have no mechanisms to force implementation in a way, right? It's different when they signed, when the signatures to the Human Rights or the Child Rights Convention or General Comment 25, people have signed up to that. But a lot of these policies, there's no delivery kind of mechanism to reinforce, to enforce their implementation. What we found though, even though we didn't analyze this, is that when there's a national policy, even if the ministers are not doing it, like a lot of other stakeholder organizations start to orient themselves towards the policy, because that's often where funding streams go. So even if there's no accountability in the policy itself, or there's no kind of clear mechanism that the Ministry of Education has to do this, or government body, we can see that funding streams start adjusting to what's in the policy, and that's often a motivator also for civil society and commercial organizations, commercial companies to do that, right? Regulation is a specific thing, so let me get to the third point. These are all government policies, so of public governing bodies. We did not look at the policies of kind of commercial big tech companies and to what extent they include children. There's actually a lot of work at the DFC who is doing that in particular to General Comment 25. There's been something about the implementation to report. Please go to the website, which I believe is up again. It was down today, but it's up again. So there's a lot of work that they have done in terms of looking at actually more commercial and big tech companies. So I would recommend that you go there. I think one of the things is to do, because this is also not as much of a public landscape often. You have to do a slightly different type of analysis. So it would be good to follow up. But some of the things I know we found in this were also kind of reflected in these digital policies. Obviously, regulation at a national level is more of a direct impact on commercial companies than what is interesting in these policies, though, is that often when there is law or regulation, and you can see it in Europe and the UK, right, it's often on the big platforms because they also have the resources, they have huge audiences, and there's less engagement with how a smaller app or something is supposed to do this, right? How do they have to have consultations with children, a diverse group of children? Do they get the resources? How is this implemented? So there is, when people are mentioned, they're also often mentioned as the people who are the stakeholders in delivery. We can see that a lot in the African continent, is that it's often Google, Microsoft, Facebook. These are the kind of three most mentioned stakeholders who are going to deliver the education agenda or the inclusion agenda for providing access and infrastructure, but also digital skills and literacy training, for example. So they are there in these policies, but they're not saying like, how are we going to regulate or make sure that they do it in a way that's good for all children. So I think that's as far as we got. So let's take some questions. If people in the room have questions, then I would love to take them. Yeah.
Hi, thank you for that. I'm Rachel Ramsey from Bright Futures Research. Brilliant project. and an amazing presentation from both of you. So thank you. I just wanted to ask a question about, it's a two-parter, about why these policies aren't being developed in collaboration with children. You know, why aren't they being involved, consulted, engaged, and actually heard? But also, are there any countries that or organisations that did do a good job there?
On the consultation in particular,
yeah.
So it's hard to say why not, because we just looked at the policies, right? You didn't interview any of the policymakers, so maybe
any hunches.
Any hunches. I think in general, I think one of the important things is that children are not talked about as agents, right, in any of these policies. So they're not seen as actually capable. Like one of the things that was also very rare was a distinction into kind of different stages of like development, right? Age-appropriate design and things like that. It was very, very rarely was that part of the discussion. Children were children, and they were seen as either these things that you give, you know, kind of a slight digital native idea, you give them digital skills training, and then they will become part of this bright digital future, or they are these victims that need protection, and the people who are going to protect them are teachers, law, regulation, adults, through adults institutions. So I think because they're not seen as agents, and here I'm going a bit beyond what we can find, but also because they are seen as not knowing what they actually need, right? We see that in terms of protection, for example, it's not based on what children have actually experienced in terms of what are the things that they find the most upsetting, harmful, and things like that. I think in the Rights AI project, for example, when we looked at some of the things that came out, especially of children from countries that are not usually represented, the countries that are usually represented in decision making, is that they said, like, you know, I am not represented in any of the things. When I do a search or I use AI, the images or the stories or the answers that I get do not represent my reality, right? So it's also a lack of understanding of, you know, what children actually experience, and that they find that very upsetting, that they can't use their own language, that when they find something, it's not, you know, that doesn't really feature in policies, that kind of stuff. So I think it's not seeing them as agents that is a real problem here. Yeah. Anya?
I actually wanted to ask Steve to meet his own challenge, if I may, because I've been thinking about it, and I was reminded that one of the things that Five Rights invited their global youth ambassadors to do, having had a consultation about children's rights in the digital environment, was then to each of the youth ambassadors wrote back to their relevant national stakeholders in their languages. I actually don't know what came of it, and you know, the answer might be depressing, but I just wonder if there is some merit in whether the researchers on the team or some of the young people that we are in touch with, you know, is there any value in feeding back the findings to all those national governments that are ignoring and misunderstanding children? Ellen, you may have a view as well, but I just wonder if there's a UNICEF's best thoughts on making the change.
Thanks, Sonia. That is, thank you for putting me on the spot, and with such a great challenge right back at us. I really like that idea. Actually, I will take it up with some of the colleagues that I've talked about, especially the Youth Foresight Fellows, who have been engaging governments more, trying to get them to think, to use foresight, to think more about digital futures and to develop policies around that. But I really like your idea of the research team actually writing to the governments. And, you know, if I can just say, you may know, but UNICEF has this annual publication called the Report Card, and it's with OECD countries. And for folks who don't know it, it's a league table, and it's a ranking across a few dimensions of how countries, rich countries, are doing by children's rights and looking after their child citizens. And it's not a way to kind of name and shame at all. It's actually a way to almost highlight what good looks like. And so in this, if there is a letter going back to the countries, it could be a way to go, this is what we found about X, and here are some suggestions for improvement. And you might want to look at, South Africa's text or India's text, on this. But I think it's a great idea, Sonia. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I think actually that is an important point, just to follow up what you were saying, Stephen, that when we're writing these reports, it's important to kind of say, like, this might not be the ideal way of putting this in a policy, but also to say, this is how it could be done in a way that's better. So I don't know if I'm going to write a full policy that would be then have to be adopted by everybody, but I think it is what is best practice or good practice. I think there's always better, but what good practice looks like, and for people to learn, because that's a request I often get actually from bodies. It's like, do you have an example where you go somewhere? Where are they doing it right? And I think so giving the not the solution, but a kind of an alternative is also good. I'll take one more question here and then we go on. Yeah.
Thank you for a really inspirational project, and the size of it and the scope of it is quite shattering. I just want to say we can't relax or be self-congratulatory in any country where we might appear to be doing better and representing children, because just simply with a change of government we've seen here, and I've worked through several different government changes, we made huge advances, even in the courts, having children represented better in the family court, and in the Department of Education, they even changed the name to Department for Children, Schools and Families, and children came first. Children's photographs were all over the department, everywhere you went there, and every policy involved children. I took many groups of children in there. In one day, in 2010, that all changed, and everything went right back to, I was told, it's too difficult to consult children. So what I'm saying is we can't be smug, we can't relax if we think we've achieved a really good set of policies. We have to be vigilant. Yeah. And I'm sad to be saying that, but I've seen it switch back to quite repressive. And so it's really important to keep that in the back of our minds.
I think, and actually what was interesting when we were doing the mapping of China with Anjan Wang, is to see how it would fluctuate depending on what the kind of priority was. And that's the same party in government. So even with the same kind of government priority, I think it's really important to think about that. Were there more questions from online? And then, yeah.
There's 3.
Okay, let's do the 3 and then we come here. I'll try to wrap them all up together.
Okay, so there's Maria, a UX research and design intern at an edtech startup. And how do you see your recommendations being applied to design or co-design of digital technologies for children? And then Maria also says it feels complicated working in university right now, given there's not a lot to focus on policies to protect them. We have another question from Saimi from Vancouver in Canada. He says it's wonderful to see this work bringing together academics and students. And just curious on the language of global north, global south, binary, and does it serve as a useful analytical lens in this study? And what ways might it have oversimplified or obscured nuance? And then the last question looks forward, and we've got Faye Marie Vassell, and she asks if the speakers can share more on their thoughts on what international or UK child-centred AI or digital policies might look like in the next 3 to 5 years, considering the changing landscapes and increasing psychosocial confusion.
I will take also this one and then we'll try to wrap it up. I just want to give Shivani a chance to say something.
Thank you. I just want to say the framework is so comprehensive, and thank you very much for sharing. I'm very familiarized with the child center digital equality framework. Because I had 3 years working in Vietnam as a digital education officer for UNICEF, so I'm really familiarized with the framework. But my question is, like, in the reality of the country I come from, Vietnam, we see the separation between like education policy in terms of digital skills and the regulation around regulating edtech platforms. And you mentioned in the digital environment, there's infrastructure design, platform design, and algorithms. And I'm very curious to learn, like, do you find any good case study of that being linked in other countries? Because in Vietnam, for example, the Ministry of Education will have policy around digital skills, infrastructure, more connectivity, but there's no talk about how edtech solutions should be regulated, because 80%, not just in Vietnam, but I think globally, of edtech solutions are not accessible for all children, especially children with disabilities. And then now we talk about algorithm with like cognition offloading, like there's lack of policy on regulating how all of this edtech tool design, because in Vietnam, they are managed by the Ministry of Information and Comms. So it's like there's a separation there. So yeah, I'm just wondering if there's any good case study and how you link this.
Yeah, so I think the simple answer to your question is no, not really. Because I think the problem you identify is a problem we've seen everywhere. And where actually there's some policies that go against each other, right? You have education policies that do one thing, and then you have online safety policies that do something that's almost against what they are trying to do in the education policy. Or digital infrastructure and inclusion policies, which is about we need to get kids online, rural kids, especially as a focus, girls, and things like that. We need to teach them digital skills to be able to produce content and be online and be part of it in that sense. But then the online safety policy is like basically saying like, well, kids are not allowed to go here, or they're saying, you know, they're actually contradicting those policies in a way, right? So the different ministries are not talking to each other in general. We didn't include it in this analysis, but from the previous one, so that's 5 years ago, this, you know, much has changed. But like in a country like Kenya, where they had a ministry of kind of children, technology, and education, it tends to be a little bit more integrated, but it depends on the focus where you're putting it. So I think different ministries fall into the transformation or the protection kind of camp. Sometimes it's the education departments, but they don't talk to each other. So I think that's actually a big problem. That's also something we identified, that policies, you know, kind of contradict each other, and that the implementation of one policy might actually mean that another policy can't be properly implemented. So I think that is also with the question about so technology and regulation. That is also an important kind of point. What we saw when they were talking about AI or design of technology, it was a lot around the discourse of misinformation, disinformation, and things like that. So then they also had, okay, we need to regulate that, and that needs to be regulated at the platform level, and we need to protect children also against inappropriate content, but also against misinformation. So it was a lot of this talk about AI and education in that sense was about protecting what they would see, that it would be vetted. There was very little in what we've seen, but I think that might be one of the changes that's coming up right now. But there was very little around actually how these companies are kind of embedding in the infrastructure of institutions like schools, their algorithms, how children are being monitored, how they don't have control over their data. Was very, very little in that. When it was about privacy, it was not about this privacy. It was about protecting your data from change, but not in that sense. So maybe that's something, there's a lot of work being done right now in EdTech. Like I can't, you know, definitely not on 2 hands, but if I had 10, I couldn't count the number of requests that we've gotten also through the DFC to look at EdTech. So I think this might be something that's going to be put on the agenda, but it's not really right now. So that is also when it comes to design or co-design with children. So I mean, you can do it in, I guess, very complicated ways. And again, I'm going to go back to the DFC here, the Digital Future for Children Center, has developed a lot of, playful design, kind of instruments that people can work with who are on the design end of things. But I think kind of involving children in the sense of listening to them, but especially because one of the things we found that even if there is consultation on these policies, which tend to be national policies, that it's a very particular group of children that's always consulted. So it doesn't reflect the diversity of children. Often they don't go kind of try to actually get at the children who might have very different experiences from the children of the designers, for example, or the people who are making the policies. So I think that is, if you think about doing co-design, is really like listening exercise, first of all, and thinking about, okay, are we designing with or for? I think Stephen used that terminology. Are we doing it for or with children and young people? And also think about, who are the people that might be engaging with your platform? And there's quite a lot of platforms who have a lot of people under the age of 18, but don't really engage with them at the different levels. And it's also different if a child is 12 or, 16 or 7 years old, so there's different techniques. So I really do recommend that you have a look at the material from the Digital Future for Children Center. So I realize we're at the end of time, but that I want to just say that we had long discussions about global north versus global south, and it's a terminology that I do not like using, also because it does not reflect the reality at all. And this is why we selected very different countries in these different regions, because often there was more similarity to countries with similar levels of inequalities and resources and kind of power positions, and they could be in the so-called global north or global south, right? But there was much more universality across countries with similar characteristics than in terms of their geographical location. We have been asked to write regional reports, and this is also when you read the detailed report where we don't say this is, Africa, or this is South America and Latin America and Caribbean, because the differences within these regions, Laura mentioned it, is also tremendous. So I think it's really, really, really difficult to say. And we use under-resourced or low-income countries, these kind of official terminologies, but none of them are really reflect that, where there's similarities. So this is why we keep emphasizing context is extremely important. You really have to understand the local history, the local kind of current, present, to be able to do this kind of research and project. So we presented a global overview, but the kind of real interest in is in the diversity of all these countries and how they've approached it. So I'm afraid I just wanted to say thank you again so much, Shivani, for all the work that you've done on this. But actually the person who we haven't mentioned yet, who's done also a tremendous amount of work, is Marisa, who is sitting in the back. So, and I just wanted to say thank you so much. Without you, and of course, the people from the DFC, Ria, Sonia, Kim, Sandra has read through the reports that she had no idea she would have to read through. So I just want to say thank you very much, because without everybody, this would have not been here and it would have not been what it was. So I would like to invite you to close off this meeting with Okay, so I think I'm trying to wrap it up. Please get in touch if you have further questions or things to follow up. We will try to respond. And bye to everybody online.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you so much.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Go to the pub now. Wherever you are, it might be very early or very late, or I see Andan is there. You must be going to bed at this point. So thank you very much. And we are going to take it to the pub around the corner. Which one? Did George? George, I think is best, no? Yeah. Did we say the George? I think we said the George. So thank you, everybody online, and hope to see you soon at a future event from the Digital